Every empire swears its money is safe. Every government insists its promises will last forever, and every time, history proves them wrong. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy to modern Lebanon, people have woken up to find their savings worthless, their salaries meaningless, and their futures stolen by systems they thought were solid. Collapse isn't rare. Collapse is the rule. The real question isn't whether financial systems fail. It's how you protect yourself when they do. The illusion of permanence is the most dangerous financial mistake any household can make right now. We look at our bank balances, our national currencies, and we assume those numbers rest on something solid and immovable. But money is not bedrock. It never has been. Money is trust, and trust can vanish without any warning overnight. This analysis draws on reported financial data, historical record, and open source economic information for educational purposes. That is exactly why history is so brutal and so useful to anyone paying attention to what is happening right now. Every collapse leaves behind a clear trail of warnings, patterns, and lessons about what actually protects real wealth. And if you study those patterns carefully, you will notice something consistent across every financial collapse ever recorded in history. The survivors were never the ones who trusted the system most. They were the ones who doubted it first. Before we go any further, drop your country in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from today. This channel reaches viewers from the United States, Malaysia, the United Kingdom, India, Canada, Australia, and dozens more countries. Your location tells us exactly who is carrying this financial anxiety right now and why these warnings carry such personal weight. Take the Byzantine Empire, often remembered as the eastern half of Rome that somehow survived a full 1,000 years after the West collapsed. At the heart of its economy was the gold solidus, a coin so reliable that merchants across 3 continents accepted it without question. For centuries, it functioned as the closest thing the medieval world had to a globally trusted reserve currency. But here's the part that should land hard for anyone watching their purchasing power quietly disappear month after month right now. You would think the Byzantines would have learned from Rome's earlier disaster with the silver denarius. Roman emperors had kept shaving that coin's silver content until it was essentially tin with a thin silver wash painted over it. But centuries later, the Byzantines made the exact same mistake, this time in gold instead of silver. They began trimming purity, stretching the supply, mixing in cheaper alloys to cover imperial debts and the cost of endless wars. At first no one noticed. Then trust cracked slowly. Merchants began refusing to accept the coin at full face value. The currency that had anchored Mediterranean trade for centuries became just another piece of political fiction backed by diminishing credibility. Debasement destroyed its value, and with it, the Byzantine economy lost the stability that had taken generations to build and maintain. What survived? Not paper promises, not government decrees, not royal proclamations about what the currency was officially worth. Merchants who had quietly accumulated real gold or land outside imperial reach preserved their wealth while everyone else watched their savings evaporate. That is the first timeless lesson this channel keeps returning to, because it keeps proving itself true in every era and every country. Governments cannot resist the temptation to dilute the money supply when military pressure, political debt, or economic desperation demands it. And when they do, real value flees toward assets that cannot be counterfeited, manipulated, or printed into worthlessness by any government on earth. Not every collapse arrives from rulers quietly tinkering with coins behind closed treasury doors. Some arrive as catastrophic external shocks with no warning. In the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by the most devastating pandemic in its recorded history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, as many as half of all Europeans died. Cities emptied, villages vanished entirely, trade routes collapsed for years. And yet, the economic story of the Black Death is far more complex than simple catastrophe and unrelieved suffering. When half the labor force disappears, the survivors become extraordinarily valuable. They could finally demand wages that reflected their true scarcity. Land that once cost a fortune could be acquired for almost nothing. Houses stood abandoned. Fields went unplowed for seasons at a time. Families with liquidity, with silver, with goods, or simply with the ability to work, suddenly had leverage they had never previously imagined. If that sounds uncomfortably familiar to anyone watching their retirement balance from a recliner right now, it absolutely should. During the COVID pandemic, we watched a modern version of this exact pattern play out in real time across every developed economy. Supply chains broke down. Governments printed trillions of dollars to keep the machine from seizing up and stopping permanently. Those with liquidity bought assets. Those living paycheck to paycheck quietly fell behind every single month and kept falling. In the United States, housing prices surged far beyond the reach of most ordinary working class and middle class Americans within 18 months. Stock markets recovered almost instantly for those already invested. Millions of working people scrambled just to cover basic rent and utilities. The rhyme across 6 centuries is impossible to ignore once you have seen it clearly stated in plain language. Pandemics redistribute wealth. They always have. The mechanism never changes, regardless of the century, the pathogen, or the technology involved. Survivors of the Black Death leveraged scarcity into land ownership and climbed the social ladder within a single generation of the disaster. Survivors of COVID with cash reserves scooped up property, stocks, and businesses that others under financial pressure were simply forced to release. The lesson is not comfortable, but it is absolutely true, and your retirement balance is sitting directly in the path of the next version. Crises reward those with reserves. They punish those without them. Every single time, without exception, throughout the entire recorded history of finance. Stay with this because what comes next exposes the specific trap that most American households are walking directly into right now without realizing it. In the 1340s, Florence was the undisputed financial capital of Europe. Home to the powerful Bardi and Peruzzi banking dynasties, these institutions had lent enormous sums to kings across Europe, most catastrophically to Edward III of England, who simply defaulted on those loans. When Edward stopped paying, both banks collapsed completely. Depositors were destroyed overnight. Trade across the entire continent froze within months. Florence, once the most powerful financial city in the medieval world, was thrown into economic chaos that lasted for a generation. The ordinary citizen who had trusted the city's great banking dynasties discovered something painful, permanent, and deeply personal in the rubble. Size was not safety. Reputation was not protection. And too big to fail was a lie even in the 14th century. What did people learn from this collapse? The same thing depositors keep relearning in every century that follows. Institutions exist to profit from the trust you extend to them. They do not exist to guarantee your personal survival in a crisis. When they fall, they take your savings with them. And the history of this lesson repeating is so consistent, it should terrify you. From Florence in the 1340s, to Lehman Brothers in 2008, to the regional American banks that collapsed quietly in early 2023. Survival belongs to those who understand that an institution's promises are only valid until the precise moment they suddenly and completely are not. If this is your first time finding this channel, what you're watching right now is the financial history that mainstream television economists will not explain. Subscribe right now, because what comes next in this video explains exactly how this same trap is being reset for ordinary families today. The American Civil War is remembered for its battles and its political legacy. But behind the gunpowder was a financial war barely taught today. Most Americans alive right now have never been told what happened to ordinary people's money during those 4 years of national collapse. The Union and the Confederacy both discovered that war on that scale required printing currency on a scale never previously attempted in American history. In the North, the government issued greenbacks, paper money not backed by gold, but by the pure promise of the United States itself. At first, it seemed bold and even patriotic. But the more greenbacks flooded the economy, the less each individual note could actually purchase. Inflation eroded their value steadily. Confidence wavered. The purchasing power of working people's wages began dissolving in ways they could not stop. In the South, the problem was not gradual erosion. It was catastrophic and absolute destruction that arrived faster than most families could respond. The Confederacy, desperate for resources and unable to raise sufficient taxes, printed Confederate currency in quantities that defied rational economic management. By the end of the war, Confederate inflation had reached levels that today sound more like fiction than documented financial history. Prices rose by thousands of percent. Soldiers received paychecks that were effectively worthless before they could find anywhere to spend them. Families carried bags stuffed with currency notes that could barely purchase a single loaf of bread from a baker who still accepted paper. By 1865, Confederate currency was not just weak and unreliable. It was completely dead. It purchased nothing. It was paper and only paper. What mattered during that collapse was not the paper in anyone's wallet, but hard assets that no government printing press could inflate away. Land, food, gold, silver, anything real that another person in genuine need would actually accept in an honest exchange. For ordinary Southern families, this was personally devastating in the most complete sense. Lifelong savings simply vanished into dust within months. For those with access to tangible goods and honest money, the war became an opportunity to acquire property at prices that seemed impossible. Here is the lesson that Americans alive today have almost certainly never been taught clearly in any classroom or mainstream financial program. Your own country has already experienced a currency collapse within its own borders, within its own history, within its own memory. And when it happened, protection came not from trusting the paper in your wallet, but from holding what no government could touch or inflate. France offers its own brutal case study in how political revolution can destroy the value of money faster than any standing army ever could. In the 1790s, after toppling the monarchy and confiscating church lands, the revolutionary government issued a new paper currency called the assignat. These notes were backed in theory by confiscated property and were supposed to stabilize an economy still reeling from monarchical mismanagement. Instead, the government printed them with abandon. Each new issue diluted the last. Prices spiraled out of reach within months. Wages failed to keep pace with costs that changed week to week and eventually morning to evening in a single trading day. Merchants refused to sell food for paper. They demanded goods or silver, anything that carried genuine exchange value behind the transaction. In Paris, the bread riots returned with violence. The revolution devoured itself from within. Ordinary people lost everything they had quietly accumulated. The winners in that collapse were not those holding patriotic paper issued by the revolutionary government promising a new and better France. They held food, gold, property, skills, anything that human beings will always need regardless of what currency is being printed and distributed. Things no government on earth can print. Things no institution can inflate into worthlessness through policy decisions made without your knowledge or consent. Promises, no matter how noble and sincere they sound when first issued, are only worth what others will freely accept in exchange. When trust breaks, your savings do not gradually decline. They do not slowly erode. They vanish, often within weeks, often without warning. In 1997, what began as a speculative attack on the Thai baht spiraled into a regional financial catastrophe almost immediately. Thailand had borrowed heavily in US dollars, fully confident its currency peg would hold against any level of speculative market pressure. When it collapsed, debts denominated in foreign currency became unpayable in a single trading session across an entire national economy. Currencies in Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, and across Southeast Asia fell in a chain reaction that no central bank could halt. Economies contracted sharply. Unemployment soared to levels that wiped out the middle class in multiple countries within the span of a year. The people who suffered most were not the global hedge funds that deliberately triggered the panic and walked away with enormous profits. It was ordinary citizens whose savings lost enormous value overnight, whose mortgage costs effectively doubled, and whose jobs simply ceased to exist. Those who held US dollars or assets outside the local banking system survived far better than those who had trusted their domestic currency. Nations drowning in foreign-denominated debt were forced into brutal austerity packages, while Wall Street institutions acquired their most valuable assets at collapsing prices. What looked like a regional currency problem was in truth a massive, coordinated transfer of wealth from ordinary families to global financial institutions. Debt denominated in someone else's currency is a death trap that governments and commercial banks sell to ordinary people as economic development and progress. When the storm arrives, the creditor does not drown. The debtor does. Without exception, without mercy, without any meaningful political recourse. By now, the picture should be forming with unmistakable clarity for anyone paying honest attention to what is actually moving in global markets today. Paper money collapses when governments lose the discipline or the political will to defend it against accumulating financial and military pressures. Debt chains nations and families in ways that remain entirely invisible until the pressure reaches a level where escape is no longer possible. And those who survive are never the ones who trusted the system most completely. They are the ones who saw the fragility first. But here is what mainstream financial media refuses to connect directly for the ordinary viewer sitting in front of this screen right now. The most dangerous part of every historical collapse documented in this video is not that it is ancient, distant, or purely academic in nature. It is happening now in countries that were supposed to be different, in systems that were supposed to have learned from history. And one collapse in particular should concern every single person watching who has a savings account, a pension, or a retirement balance anywhere. Part 2 opens with the collapse that struck closest to home and carries the most direct lessons for every financial decision you will make from this point forward. Between 2019 and 2021, the Lebanese banking system did something that still feels unthinkable to most people living in any developed economy today. They locked the doors. Ordinary citizens woke up to find their deposits frozen, their withdrawals blocked, and their currency in complete freefall. The Lebanese pound lost over 90% of its value within a period that most economists still struggle to fully describe in rational terms. A lifetime of savings became a pocket change. Decades of disciplined work became worth almost nothing in practical day-to-day purchasing terms. People lined up outside their own banks, begging for access to money they had earned, deposited, and trusted to be held safely for them. And they were told, through security glass and locked metal doors, that their money was simply not available for withdrawal. It was not just small savers and low-income families standing in those lines outside shuttered bank branches in Beirut. Middle-class families, retirees with their entire life savings deposited, doctors, engineers, business owners, professionals of every description, anyone who had trusted the system because the system had spent decades telling them it was stable, regulated, and safe. They were wiped out. Not by a foreign invasion, not by a natural disaster, by the institutions they had trusted without question. And a viewer who commented on this channel confirmed that, as of late 2025, those accounts remain frozen and largely inaccessible. 6 years of waiting with no clear answer on whether deposits will ever be returned, partially returned, or quietly written off is gone. The lesson that Lebanon delivers to every person watching this right now is direct, uncomfortable, and impossible to honestly dismiss. Your money sitting inside a bank is not a personal treasure chest that belongs to you and patiently waits for your use. It is a loan you have made to an institution that can decide, during any sufficiently severe crisis, simply not to repay you. The people who survived the Lebanese banking collapse best shared a small number of common characteristics worth examining carefully. They had placed assets outside the domestic banking system before the crisis became publicly visible and before the doors were welded shut. They held real assets, physical gold, property in other countries, or foreign currency that existed entirely beyond the reach of the collapsing system. Some had moved portions of their savings outside the banking infrastructure completely, a decision that seemed excessive and paranoid until it was not. Everyone else was trapped behind glass, not by war, not by flood, not by anything external, by their own unexamined trust in a system. If Lebanon feels geographically distant and economically irrelevant to your situation, consider carefully what happened inside the United States in recent memory. In 2008, American homeowners watched equity they had spent years building disappear entirely within months as the housing market collapsed beneath them. Pension funds that retirees had contributed to for decades were decimated. The institutions that created the crisis were bailed out at public expense. Taxpayers who had done nothing wrong absorbed losses that institutions had generated through deliberate, structured financial risk-taking at a scale that defied belief. In 2020, governments printed trillions of dollars within months to keep the machine alive. Asset prices inflated rapidly for those who already owned them. Wages for working people stagnated while the cost of housing, food, insurance, and energy consumed steadily larger portions of every paycheck. In 2023, multiple American regional banks collapsed within days as depositor confidence evaporated faster than any regulatory response could contain the damage. Each time, the institution survived through emergency government intervention funded by the same taxpayers who had been failed by those institutions. Each time, ordinary depositors and retirement savers absorbed the practical consequences of decisions they had no role in making and no warning about. Each time, the underlying lesson was identical, and the mainstream financial press was careful never to state it too directly or too plainly. The system protects its own institutional structures first. It protects its depositors second, and only to the extent that political pressure demands it. If you're still watching, share this video right now with one person in your life who still believes the bank is the safest place for savings. Because what we have not reached yet is the most important and most uncomfortable question this entire history raises, and it has no clean answer. So how do you actually protect yourself when this pattern completes its current cycle in your lifetime and on your balance sheet? History offers no single universal answer that works identically across every type of collapse, in every economic environment and every political context. The asset that provided protection depends entirely on the specific nature and trigger of each individual collapse. In Byzantium, it was physical gold held outside imperial reach, something the emperor could not debase, confiscate, or inflate away through policy. After the Black Death, it was liquidity that allowed survivors to acquire abandoned land at prices that previously would have been completely unimaginable. In Florence, it was the refusal to concentrate everything inside institutions that looked enormous, permanent, and completely beyond any possibility of failure. In the Confederacy, it was hard goods and precious metals that retained genuine exchange value when paper currency died completely and finally. In revolutionary France, it was food, property, and productive skill, the tangible things human beings will need regardless of what currency is printed. In Asia, in 1997, it was assets denominated in stable foreign currency that held value when domestic currency collapsed in a matter of sessions. In Lebanon, it was simply getting money and assets out of the banking system. Before the morning, the doors were permanently and silently closed. The asset class that provides protection shifts depending on the nature of each specific collapse. But one theme holds constant across all of them. Survival does not come from blind and unexamined trust in paper promises or the institutions that create, manage, and profit from those promises. It comes from understanding what holds genuine value when the illusions that underpin modern financial systems are finally removed by force or by failure. And here, is the paradox that the institutions currently managing your retirement savings will never voluntarily explain during any quarterly statement or customer call. Collapse is simultaneously a devastating tragedy for the unprepared and an extraordinary economic opportunity for those who understood what was coming. For the unprepared majority, it is ruin. For those who hold resilience, liquidity, and assets that cannot be printed away, it is a transfer window. The moment to acquire real wealth at a fraction of what it cost during the years when the illusions were still fully intact and functioning. After the Black Death, peasants became landowners because there was too much land and far too few people alive to farm or occupy it. After 2008, those who held cash bought homes at fire sale prices, while millions of families were being foreclosed upon and removed from their properties. History shows repeatedly that positioning yourself before a collapse is not just defensive financial management. It is the oldest form of wealth building that exists. But the deepest form of protection across every collapse this channel has examined goes far beyond the assets you own or the currency you hold. It is about what you can genuinely produce when the systems that currently distribute goods and services begin to deteriorate under sustained pressure. The survivors of every historical financial collapse were not only those who had accumulated gold, land, or foreign currency reserves before the crisis. They were those who could create real value when the infrastructure supporting the modern economy began to break down under the weight of its own contradictions. The baker who could still produce bread when supply chains failed. The craftsman who could still repair tools and equipment when replacements were unavailable. The farmer who could still feed a neighborhood when distribution networks collapsed. The mechanic who could keep essential vehicles running on minimal resources. These were not just survivors of historical collapses. They were the people who rose through them while everyone around them was falling. A viewer who commented on a previous episode recalled witnessing exactly this dynamic following the ruble's hyperinflation in Russia in 1993. Ordinary working people tended small plots of land on weekends, growing food, raising animals, maintaining skills their grandparents had passed down and never discarded. That dual capacity, formal employment during the week combined with genuine productive capability outside the monetary economy, was what carried families through the worst. In every financial crisis throughout recorded history, money eventually loses its functional meaning. But productive human capability never does and never will. People still need to eat regardless of what the currency does. They still need to build, repair, trade, and live in functional communities. And those who can meet those fundamental needs are never poor for long, regardless of what the official financial statistics say about their net worth. Here's the number that should make this personal and immediate for every middle-class household watching this right now on any device. The average American household carries well over $100,000 in total consumer debt, not counting the primary mortgage balance. Meanwhile, the average retirement savings balance for Americans between the ages of 55 and 64 sits at roughly $250,000. Think carefully about that arithmetic for a moment. The debt and the savings are racing against each other in opposite directions simultaneously. And inflation, even at the officially reported and deliberately conservative figures governments prefer to publish, is draining the savings column every single month. A dollar carefully saved in the year 2000 has already lost roughly 40% of its original purchasing power by today, using official government measurements. Independent economists and commodity price markets suggest the real erosion of purchasing power is considerably steeper than what official reports publicly acknowledge. The math that television economists are paid not to explain to their audiences in direct and simple terms works out to something deeply uncomfortable. You are not merely saving against your future retirement needs. You're saving against a system that is actively and continuously eroding what you save. And while ordinary households focus on maintaining their balance and making their monthly contributions, the institutions managing that money are making very different preparations. Central banks globally have been accumulating physical gold at some of the highest recorded rates seen in several decades of tracking that data. Foreign governments have been quietly reducing their holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds and moving toward tangible, non-printable assets at an accelerating pace. The institutions responsible for maintaining the current financial system understand what every pattern in this video demonstrates with complete historical clarity. When trust breaks at scale, paper does not protect you. Tangible assets do. And they are positioning accordingly while most families remain distracted. The deepest lesson running through every collapse, documented in this video, is one that modern financial commentary consistently and deliberately avoids stating plainly. Every financial crisis is ultimately a transfer, from the many who trusted completely to the few who prepared quietly and positioned themselves in advance. From paper promises that governments could not honor to tangible value that exists independently of any institution's continued solvency or political survival. From passive savers who assumed the system would protect them to active builders who understood the system was designed to serve itself first. This pattern has repeated with absolute consistency from Byzantium, through Florence, through revolutionary France, through the American Civil War, through Asia, through Lebanon. The tragic arithmetic of collapse does not change, regardless of the century, the technology, or the sophistication of the financial instruments involved. Those who hold paper when collective trust finally breaks will lose. Those who hold real assets before that moment will accumulate from what remains. So the question that this video ultimately puts directly to every person watching is not whether the current system will face this kind of stress. History answers that question with a kind of brutal consistency that leaves no honest room for reassuring exceptions or comfortable dismissals. The question is whether you will be among the many left holding promises on the morning those promises are no longer honored by anyone, or among the few holding something real, something that does not require the continued trust and solvency of a third party to retain its value. History does not repeat in identical detail, but it rhymes with a precision that should make every viewer approaching retirement age deeply and urgently uncomfortable. And if you ignore it long enough, it will not merely rhyme with your situation. It will describe it directly, in your account, in your lifetime. Subscribe to this channel right now because what is moving in global debt markets, central bank gold reserves, and sovereign bond holdings at this exact moment suggests the next chapter of this pattern is already in its opening pages. The viewers who understand what history actually shows will be the only ones positioned to see it coming before the doors close one more time.